25 years ago, my husband and I arrived in New York so he could pursue his PhD. I was terrified. I would never have gone to New York on my own. There were so many people, such tall buildings, horror stories, crime, drugs. For the first week, I wouldn't go anywhere by myself. But we had to put food on the table, so I had to go out and look for a job. We were in New York, so I thought, what about Wall Street? This is not what women in my demographic did. We worked until we got pregnant, and then we stayed home. I was a music major. I had never set foot in accounting, finance, or any type of business course. So I started as a secretary. This isn't how we dressed. Every day, I would sit at my desk, sitting across from the bullpen, essentially a locker room, 20-something guys, aspiring masters of the universe, if only they can get the person on the other end of the line to buy 100 shares of waste management stock. It was a tough slog. They'd dial the phone, people would hang up, dial again. When they finally got someone on the line, testosterone pressure was so intense, they'd go for the hard sell. Throw down your pom-poms and get in the game. At first, I was offended. I had been a proud cheerleader in high school. But then I thought, I think I want to get in the game. And then I wondered, how do these guys know they can aspire to be masters of the universe? The last time I felt like the master of anything was third grade. I was master of multiplication tables, master of dodgeball, and even of playground bullies. But as a teenager, I had dumbed it down. Like the time when my boyfriend got a 94 on a test to my 92, and I was relieved because I was afraid that if I would beat him, I might upset the equilibrium. It had been 20 years since third grade. 20 years out of the game. And it was time to get back in. I started taking courses at night, and after 3 hard years, a boss who believed in me and my secret weapon, a husband who provided emotional support, I was able to move up the Wall Street food chain from secretary to investment banker to equity analyst, and then eventually co-founded an investment firm with Harvard's Clayton Christensen. After third grade, my sense of self was disrupted. I wouldn't have known to call it this then, but when marriage, yes, ironically, marriage helped me reclaim my third grade self, and I walked onto Wall Street through the secretarial back door, I had again become a disruptor. Now, for a quick review, I know Mary talked about it this morning, but disruptive innovation is a term coined by Clay Christensen to describe a low-end or new market innovation that eventually upends an industry. Disruptors secure a foothold, think Amazon in the 90s, at the low end of the market, and then in the pursuit of profit, gradually produce higher performance, higher margin products. Established competitors, Barnes & Noble, Borders, could aggressively counter an attack by a low-end disruptor. But they don't, because it doesn't make financial sense to defend their least profitable products when they themselves could move up market. Until, of course, it does make sense, and by then it's too late. To be fair, in a climate of disruption, we're dealing with time delays. When systems behave linearly, we're fairly accurate with our forecasts. Flip a switch, and the light goes on. But when they don't, our predictive power plummets. Meaning, when an industry is going through an upheaval, it's a really good time for innovation. But for the individual, experiencing a seismic shift in what his or her job looks like, it can be pretty unsettling. So, how do we cope with and even harness the unpredictability of disruption? S-curve math helps us gauge how quickly an innovation will be adopted. It also helps us deal with these time delays, providing milestones that we can watch for. At the outset, growth will be slow. Once a tipping point is reached, typically 10 to 15%, we move into hypergrowth. At 90% or saturation, growth tapers off. Facebook, for example. Assuming a market opportunity of 1 billion people, which it's now exceeded, it took 4 years to reach penetration of 10%. Once it had reached this critical mass, it moved into hypergrowth and didn't add 100 million, but rather 800 million users over the next 4 years. We could quibble over whether or not it has reached saturation, but there is no question that the growth has begun to slow. S-curve math also helps us understand the psychology of disruption. If, for example, you've just started a new project or taken on a new role, the S-curve helps you understand that initially growth will appear non-existent. This helps avoid discouragement. Then, as you put into the hours, you'll accelerate into competence and confidence, and as you approach mastery, the less you'll enjoy the feel-good effects of learning, and boredom can kick in. If at this point you don't jump to a new curve or aren't allowed to jump, your plateau can become a precipice. There are volumes of research indicating that the odds of success improve for companies, even countries, when you pursue a disruptive course. I believe this powerful mindset begins with the individual. If you can ride the waves of learning and maxing out, you will have a competitive advantage in an era of accelerating disruption. And whether an organization or an individual, there are a number of variables that can accelerate or decelerate movement along the curve. The first one is to take the right risks. People don't buy products, they hire them to fill needs. Disruptors look for needs not being met and then try something new rather than competing against established curves of learning. So if a colleague says to you, you know what, there is this huge market opportunity and I have got the projections to prove it, it's likely that that competitor, there already are competitors, that they have scoped out the market and you are taking on competitive risk. But if a colleague says, I don't know if there's a market, and I actually don't have projections, but I think there's a need not being met, let's design a test to figure this out. You're taking on market risk. Counterintuitively, this is less risky. One of my friends has triplets. When they were 11 years old, they decided they wanted to earn some money. So they set up a lemonade stand. Instead of in front of their house, though, they set up next to the football field after football practice in late August. These 11-year-olds intuitively understood how to take on market risk. There was no guarantee that there would be a market, but there was no competition either. So if there were going to be customers, they were going to make a whole lot more than friends and family dollars, which in fact they did. Remember, these are 11-year-olds, $75 in about 15 minutes. Southern New Hampshire University. A decade ago, it was a 2,000-person college with declining enrollment. Instead of trying to play catch-up and compete with the Ivies, it decided to take on market risk, playing where no one else was playing, online. Today, it's considered the Amazon of education, with 34,000 students enrolled, and it's in the process of jumping to yet another curve, competency-based education, where students pay by time, not credit. One student demonstrated 120 competencies in less than 6 months. His associate's degree cost a whopping $1,250, says the mother who has a son who's about to go to college. Rachel Chong, the CEO of Catch a Fire, is another person who knows how to take the right risks. She saw a need that wasn't being met. Social good organizations that desperately needed volunteers. But once they got those volunteers, they didn't know what to do with them. Stuff envelopes, give us money. Chong came up with a plan to templatize the various functions of a nonprofit so that skilled professionals could directly plug into the organization. Because she took on market instead of competitive risk, today she's got a network of 5,000 social good organizations and nearly 20,000 skilled volunteers. It is easy to think about what your competitors are doing. Disruptors think about what they're not doing at the low and especially the high end of the curve. In looking for unmet needs, disruptors try to match those needs with their distinctive strengths. A distinctive strength being something that you do well that people in your sphere don't. Now, the trouble with strengths is they're easy to overlook because you do them reflexively well. So here are a few clues. What makes you feel strong? Marcus Buckingham said, "Strengths clamor for our attention in the most basic way. Using them makes us feel strong. We feel inquisitive, invigorated, successful." Erin Newkirk, the founder of Red Stamp, is a person who has built a business on what makes her feel strong. Red Stamp is an app that helps people be thoughtful on the go, and what makes her feel strong is sending notes and cards to connect with loved ones. When you're working with other people, what exasperates you? The frustration of genius is in believing that what's easy for you is also easy for other people. For example, I can spell really well. Give me a page and I can find the errors like that, lickety-split. Can't everybody spell well? What do others say you do well? If you look at your LinkedIn profile, I know there's some odd surprises, but there are also some really interesting surprises. What do people endorse you for? What compliments do you habitually dismiss? If people give you a compliment a lot, and you find yourself saying, it was nothing, that's very likely one of your strengths. I would say to you that your greatest superpowers are very likely not on your resume because, like the nose on your face, you've overlooked them. Do you have a confluence of skills, an intersection of seemingly ordinary proficiencies? You may not be able to claim that you're the world's best PHP programmer or a Unix guru, or even an apparel e-commerce domain expert. But for the right customer, the fact that you're an excellent PHP programmer who also knows Unix and apparel e-commerce, this is a distinctive strength. Adam Richardson, his passion was cars, and he always wanted to be a designer. Even as a child, he would survey every car he could find he would survey every adult that he could find about the kind of car they wanted, and he would measure in great detail each of those cars. 30 years ago, this was a distinctive strength. No one was approaching design through the lens of research. Interestingly, Adam started out his career in a very traditional industrial designer role at Sun Microsystems. He soon started to observe that many of his colleagues were brilliantly creative, but they weren't particularly attuned to customer needs. Adam, by contrast, was not the strongest stylist, but he was enthralled with market research. He finally got up the courage to veer off the traditional path. He went back to school. He studied anthropology, sociology, art history. Adam was a good industrial designer, but when he was finally willing to play to his distinctive strength, approaching design through the lens of research, he was able to make the leap to his dream job at design consultancy Frog. Whatever your discipline, get the basic skills you need to do your job. Then focus on what your company, your team, and you do uniquely well. If the market doesn't recognize or value this initially, even better, because that's going to be your edge as you scale the curve of innovation. Embrace constraints. I have, for many years, extolled the virtues of bootstrapping a business without any real experience of pulling up the straps myself. I loved other people's constraints. Recently, as I've become an entrepreneur, I've come to appreciate my own constraints because they help me understand what I actually and truly bring to the table. Nancy Lublin, the founder of Dress for Success, said, "When you ask yourself, what would you do if you had zilch, you'll be surprised at just how powerful zero is." Constraints lead to faster feedback. It has been posited, for example, that skateboarders are some of the quickest learners in the world because they receive incredibly fast and useful feedback. Every action, every move has an immediate consequence. Additional degrees of freedom or the lack of constraints are on the surface exhilarating, but they create a complexity that's hard to optimize. 10 degrees of freedom, 10 degrees of freedom, 2 options, you've got 1,024 possibilities. 1 degree of freedom, 2 possibilities. By limiting your options, you effectively make your problem smaller and have more relative capacity with which to solve it. At the low end of the curve, you will undoubtedly be short on time, money, expertise, or buy-in, at which point you can give up or you can embrace your constraints. And then comes the hard part. Once you start to have margins expand and plaudits accrue, if you want to have the wherewithal to scale to the peak and then be able to jump to new curves, you've got to learn to create constraints. Intuit, who brought us QuickBooks and TurboTax, is a good example of how to do this. The VP of Product Development was given the mandate to improve the lives of India's 1.2 billion people. That's all. Amazingly, Intuit didn't throw a lot of resources at this. They sent 3 engineers to rural India for 3 weeks and said, figure something out. The engineers soon discovered that farmers in the rural areas had trouble getting access to commodity prices. So they began experimenting, manually texting price and buyer information. Because Intuit was willing to create constraints and the engineers were willing to embrace constraints, today the service known as Fossil is a sophisticated text message-based platform using complicated algorithms to help farmers get the best prices. It has over 2 million users who enjoy a 20% increase in their bottom line. In 1954, an editor at Houghton Mifflin read the now famous article, Why Johnny Can't Read. Concerned, he said to one of his editor friends, "Take 225 words every 6-year-old knows and write me a story they can't put down." It took him a year and a half, and he became so discouraged that at one point he almost gave up. But in 1957, when Theodore Geisel published The Cat in the Hat, it was an instant hit. Years of reciting rhymes, of creating cartoons, of leveraging what he did uniquely well prepared Geisel to reinvent children's literature when presented with a 225-word constraint. For disruptors, constraints aren't a check on absolute freedom. They're a tool of creation. Battle entitlement. Entitlement inhibits innovation. In one of the startups I backed, we had allocated $90,000 for a particular expenditure. At the last moment, one of the senior decision makers unilaterally made changes, none of which were critical, just to throw their weight around. This led to a crippling overage of $30,000, a factor in the company's demise. Because of this individual's entitlement, innovation, growth, a company, jobs, and money were all lost. Now, we tend to think of entitlement, this attitude of I exist, therefore I deserve, happening at the low end of the curve. But we know from this example that we need to play whack-a-mole with entitlement, up, down, and all around. Maybe you've had this experience. A colleague of yours that you like quite a lot has just gotten a really deserved opportunity, and you think to yourself, good for them, and you tell them, good for them. But there's a piece of you that snivels. Why didn't I get this opportunity? Why do I even bother trying? I felt this way. Not appreciating, not seeing abundance in the success of other people is a form of entitlement. Which is why I love the story of Dr. Stephen Curley, a cancer researcher at MD Anderson in Houston, and John Kansas, a radio technician, who believed you could treat cancer using non-invasive radio frequency waves, a conclusion he'd reached experimenting with pie pans and hot dogs. When John Kansas cold called Dr. Curley could have easily dismissed him as a crackpot. He's a radio technician, what does he know? And even if he did feel like he knew something, why should he get a shot? He hasn't worked that hard. I've gone to medical school for a lot of years. But because Dr. Curley was willing to listen, meaning he wasn't entitled, he may very well preside over a breakthrough in cancer research. We all want innovation and growth, so let's whack a mole. Step back or sideways in order to grow. When companies get too big, they often stop exploring smaller opportunities because the revenue just isn't big enough. There are so many examples of this. Yahoo, sorry if you're in the room, for one. In 2013, their earnings were up 40%, their stock price doubled as a result, but the fact is that their top line was still under siege because they had dismissed opportunities once thought too small or too much of a hassle to pursue. Just as Yahoo has been slow to embrace content marketing and mobile, Borders neglected e-commerce. People can stall at the top of their learning curve. The way to avoid this is to jump to a new curve. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to change jobs. Dave Blakely, for example, started his career at IDEO as a software engineer. He could have worked his way up to manage technical staff, but early on he volunteered to become a project manager. Many of his peers dismissed this step back as an escape route from the rigor and detail of engineering, but this backward move allowed Blakely to begin to climb a new ladder, and today he's the head of technology strategy at IDEO. Beware the undertow of the status quo. Lots of your stakeholders will say, "We like you right where you are." And in fact, they may even express concern, questioning your sanity. But you know this step back could turn out to be a slingshot forward. Whenever you take on a new project or a new role, there's this fantasy of a simple, linear world. You'll work hard and your dream will come true. One straight shot up the y-axis of success. And then sometimes it doesn't. My whales of fails include bombing a speech in front of hundreds of people, being fired, and, as I said, backing a business that imploded. When I fail, no matter how many chirpy quotes I tweet, I am despondent, pessimistic, and I want to move because I can never show my face in public ever again. Marjorie Howell said, "There is dignity in suffering, nobility in pain, but failure is a salted wound that burns and burns again." According to the psychologist Brené Brown, failure is especially acute for the military, professional athletes, and corporate professionals. When the ethos is kill or be killed, control or be controlled, failure is being killed, and it elicits tremendous shame. Most of us think of Steve Jobs as the iconic figure unveiling the next insanely great Apple product, but he was also the despairing founder, curled up in a fetal position, sobbing on a mattress in an unfurnished house when the Apple board fired him in 1985. When I fail, I'm embarrassed, but I'm also heartbroken. I had envisioned a future in which I would achieve a goal, maybe even be hailed the conquering hero, and then I didn't, and I wasn't. It's important to grieve. If we sublimate the sadness, we risk losing our passion. We also need to ditch the shame, because if we don't, we'll never launch another product or speak in public ever again. Daring to disrupt is equal to daring to fail. Not just the fail fast kind of failure that we celebrate at the low end of the curve, but the really big failures. And if you as a leader want your people to innovate, you will create a context where the stakes are low enough, financial and reputational, that your people can fail. They can pull the shame out of the equation, absorb the failure, and by their very own grit, turn that failure into success. As a disruptor, you are in search of a yet-to-be defined market. This requires an emergent strategy, or in your parlance, continuous development. Instead of developing a step-by-step plan to achieve your goal, you take a step forward, gather feedback, adapt accordingly. This probably means you'll end up in a place you hadn't anticipated. You won't be alone. 70% of all successful new businesses end up in a different place, too. Groupon started out as a platform to help people fundraise for a cause and to boycott retailers, which I find ironic. Netflix started out as a door-to-door DVD rental service. Personal example is Sabina Nawaz. She started her career as a software engineer at Microsoft. She was working hard, probably positioning herself for a coveted VP role when she received some feedback that she had really great management skills, and so she decided to disrupt herself and to move into human resources. 7 years later, after continuing to climb, she eventually stopped or left and started her own leadership development consultancy. This had never been her original ambition, but Sabina and Microsoft were willing to let her strategy emerge. We all like to make plans for the future, but pursuing a disruptive course requires that we can't see the top of the curve from the bottom of the curve. It also means that we need to get the metrics right in order to measure our progress. To help me with this, I'd like to take a page out of Billy Beane's playbook. For those of you unfamiliar with Moneyball, it's an account by the brilliant Michael Lewis, who wrote Liar's Poker, of how the Oakland A's, one of the poorest teams in Major League Baseball, became one of the most successful because Billy Beane was willing to recast how he measured performance. Pitcher Chad Bradford, for example. When the A's acquired him, he had a relatively slow fastball of 81 to 85 miles per hour, and because he looked funny when he pitched, the scouts discounted him. Because Beane's foremost concern was assembling a winning team on a budget, he was willing to look past conventional metrics. Bradford gave up hits like any other pitcher, but his ground ball to fly ratio was 5-to-1 versus 1-to-1. Ground balls don't get hit over the wall, they make singles, occasionally doubles. When you disrupt, if conventional metrics don't apply, be your own Billy Beane and find the metrics that measure you. Now, the most important metric of success is how many times you show up. According to the research, the odds of a scientist writing a groundbreaking research paper are correlated not to how smart the scientist is, but to how many papers the scientist has written. Once a startup makes it to the final round of a pitch contest, there's no statistical difference between the returns of the finalists and the actual winners. It's called the equal odds rule. If you want to write a frequently cited paper, publish a lot. If you want to ship successful products, design and deliver continuously, and if you want to get good at jumping to new curves, jump. A simple metric, show up and keep showing up. Now here's one more thing. The textbooks on disruption don't tell you. Disruption is by definition scary and lonely. Many of you have probably had the experience of announcing to the market what you believe will be a game-changing initiative, only to see your net promoter score or your stock price go into free fall. And then there's personal disruption. When I moved from banking to equity research, and then again when I left Wall Street, I felt a loss of identity. It used to be that I could call up people and say, Whitney Johnson, Merrill Lynch, and now it was Whitney Johnson. And some days that wasn't enough. There have been other times when the PE, or puke to excitement ratio, has been so uncomfortably high, I feel like I'm on a thrill ride to zero cash flow. This doesn't mean you shouldn't disrupt. It just means if it's scary and lonely, you're probably on the right track. In fact, if you have a feeling in the deepest part of yourself that you need to try something new and you don't, you'll probably die inside just a little. That's why we call it the Innovators Dilemma. Whether you innovate or not, you risk downward mobility, which is why our dreams are so important. When you dream, you hunger for a better life. When you dream, you become a problem solver, letting nothing stand in your way. Dreaming is the engine of disruption. And the odds of success are 6 times higher and the revenue opportunity 20 times greater when you pursue a disruptive course. Most of us are quite adept at doing the math around the future when things are linear. But neither business nor life is linear. And what the brain craves, even requires, is the delicious dopamine of the unpredictable. Saul Kaplan, the chief catalyst of the Business Innovation Factory, said, "My life has been about searching for the steep learning curve because that's where I do my best work. And when I do my best work, money, stature, and happiness have always followed." We give a lot of airtime to building and buying disruptive companies. We should. But innovation ultimately begins on the inside. We start at the low end of the curve. We shift into gears that will allow us to scale. And when our learning crests, we do what all great disruptors do. We walk straight into the Innovators Dilemma and jump. Because companies don't disrupt, people do. Thank you.